Today I'll be talking about World War I. Here I'm not going to cover the military aspect of the war. I'm pretty sure that you have a decent idea about the World War I in terms of military involvement. But I'm going to discuss the perception of the common Americans. I'll talk about how US government tackled the war situation and how US society, economy, and culture got impacted because of the World War I. We'll start with the perception of common Americans. Most Americans were united in their disgust at the war. They were also relieved that a large body of water lay between themselves and the battlefields. Drawn as they were from diverse backgrounds, Americans were divided in their sympathies for antagonists. Most native-born Protestants were significantly sympathetic to Britain and its allies. Many Americans, regardless of ethnicity, also considered English-speaking Britain a natural US ally. The tens of thousands of Serbs and Slovaks who had settled in Midwestern cities opposed Austria-Hungary, whereas Russian Jewish people and exiled socialists hoped that the war would finally topple the Tsarist regime in Russia. Unsurprisingly, most German Americans sympathized with Germany and Austria-Hungary, while the nation's 4.5 million Irish Americans were strongly critical of Ireland's British overlords. Regardless of America's sympathies or ethnic backgrounds, the great majority viewed the war as Europe's problem and supported US neutrality. Swimming against the American mainstream in 1916, former President Theodore Roosevelt and many other Republicans made the case for national preparedness. The position that the United States should build its armed forces in preparation for joining the fight on the side of Britain. Arguing strenuously against flabby pacifism, Roosevelt condemned the progressive idea that nations should abandon war and cooperate with one another as dangerously unrealistic. Although once a champion of progressivism, Roosevelt rallied against President Wilson, gathering around himself a cohort of self-identified conservatives whose defining belief was that all nations pursue and should pursue their own national interest. Roosevelt's viewpoint appealed to military leaders, the financial sector, which had bankrolled and profited from the Spanish-American War, and Republicans of the older generation. The majority of Americans, however, preferred neutrality. Consequently, Roosevelt and other conservatives took the case of preparedness directly to consumer, publicizing it through songs, the press, and movies. Preparedness soon attracted more utterance, largely among the growing and diverse communities of men and women who saw themselves as defenders of what they believed were true American values. Conservative women's organizations, such as the United Daughters of Confederacy, abandoned their previous opposition to the war and now argued that preparedness was the best way to protect American homes. The Daughters of American Revolution and the American Defense Society called on the United States to begin arming. Despite the growing conservative movement and widespread anti-German feeling, most Americans still supported neutrality in 1916 and believed that the war was of little consequence to America. In fact, the war had already significantly affected the US economy, national security, and international standing. Wilson was rethinking his policy of neutrality, and politically powerful progressives were growing divided on the question. Many dropped their opposition to the war after they observed the tremendous expansion of government power that had occurred throughout Europe as a result of war mobilization. Wilson and other progressives also now saw the war as a prime vehicle for a crusade to bring American-style democracy to a troubled world. As the war escalated, the United States' strong cultural, economic, and diplomatic ties to Britain and growing anti-German sentiment undercut Wilson's official policy of neutrality. Within months of outbreak of hostilities, the war lifted the flagging US economy out of severe industrialization, lowered unemployment to historic lows, and raised wages. American arms, food, and consumer goods found their way to Britain and France. Exports to allies quadrupled between 1914 and 1916. Headed by Herbert Hoover, a major food relief operation also got underway in the late 1914 for Britain's starving ally Belgium in the wake of Germany's devastating attack. Wilson approved massive loans for the allies, but the Germans received just over a tenth of that amount. From the German perspective, the United States had implicitly aligned with the allies. The combatants' naval strategies also affected the United States. Almost immediately after war broke out, Britain's Royal Navy blockaded Germany in an effort to starve it of imported food, war materials, and consumer goods. Desperate to break the embargo, but militarily outmatched, the German Navy launched attacks on British commercial and naval vessels. Over 200 American ocean-going passengers died between 1914 and 1917, including 128 Americans who lost their lives when a U-boat opened fire on the British passenger liner Lusitania. That was in May 1915. Theodore Roosevelt and fellow conservative ethno-nationalists immediately called for war, but Wilson and most Americans remained committed to neutrality. Wilson sharply rebuked the German government for a Lusitania attack and demanded an apology. But he made no threat of action. Ignoring advice of Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan to reassure the German privately that he expected a peaceful resolution of the incident, Wilson quietly embraced preparedness. He announced plans to put the US Navy on par with the world's largest fleet, Britain's Royal Navy, by 1920 and called for expansion of the army. When Bryan resigned in protest, Wilson replaced him with Robert Lansing, who believed that US entry into the war on Britain's side was only a matter of time. After more Americans died or were seriously injured in U-boat attacks, Wilson threatened to break off diplomatic ties with Berlin, a response that Germans mistakenly interpreted as an indirect threat to go to war. The Germans believed it would take the United States a long time to raise and mobilize forces, but they were also eager to avoid even minor naval skirmishes. Consequently, U-boats ceased surprise attacks on ocean liners and other merchant vessels. Despite his strides toward preparedness in 1916, Wilson remained unconvinced that the United States should enter the war. He was certain, however, that he could not win the election of 1916 on a preparedness platform. Instead, he walked a line between the pacifism of most voters and the growing popularity of preparedness. The election was one of the closest in presidential history, with Wilson defeating Republican Charles Evan Hughes by only 23 electoral votes and under 600,000 popular votes. By summer 1917, American soldiers were sorely needed in France, where the war had bogged down in the mud-filled trenches and dissolute battlefields. The war had become an endurance race in which the victor was certain to be the nation that could sustain production of the vast quantities of food and material that were needed on the battlefronts and in Europe's towns and cities. The US role would be both military and economic, therefore, and would require the government to mobilize the nation's resources fully. President Wilson approved a military draft and convened a series of powerful committees answerable directly to his cabinet. Thousands of progressive experts went to work for new federal agencies, raising and training an army, coordinating industry and agriculture, and mobilizing women as factory workers and household budgeters. The US government pursued a policy of war collectivism by which it took direct control of the economy for the purpose of optimizing the war effort. Rather than imposing, rationing, and directly managing the economy as the alliance government had, Wilson invited union leaders and captains of industry to work together to help direct the economy. Government boards made up of labor leaders, industrialists, and various experts coordinated every aspect of the economy from fuel consumption, industrial output, food production, and railroads to garbage disposal and household management. Even time was regulated, with the adoption in 1918 of daylight saving, which extended the hours of natural light and conserved energy that would have otherwise been used to light the workplace. Standard time zone also became federal law. Progressive experts and advocates entered government service to head new agencies and serve as foot soldiers in the emerging bureaucracies. The War Industries Board, or WIB, played the central role in coordinating the war economy and fulfilling the needs of the Allies and the US military. For the first time in American history, the government helped set wages for industrial workers. The National War Labor Board got workers and business leaders to negotiate mutually agreeable conditions and wages. The board mediated over 1,200 disputes and encouraged equal wages for women. It also made strikes illegal in return for allowing workers to unionize. Minimum wages and working conditions for labor in every important war industry were set, and the 8-hour day became standard, as did overtime pay. As men were drafted into military and the demand for industrial workers rose, wages surpassed previous highs. Wilson's Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, proceeded to set the prices of household foods such as wheat, sugar, and coffee, and to procure basic foodstuffs for the Allies and the US Armed Forces. In establishing high prices for wheat and other commodities, the FA encouraged an increase in production, which in turn provided much needed economic relief to farmers and enormous profits to agribusiness. Federal agents fanned out across the rural hinterland, offering expert help to farmers and distributing fuel, equipment, and fertilizer to regions deemed wartime priorities. Scout troops, prisoners, and homemakers planted vegetable gardens to boost production, and some 20,000 college women joined the Federal Women's Land Army, who performed essential farm work in place of men who had been drafted. At the other end of the food chain, Hoover stopped short of unpopular British model of rationing and instead urged homemakers to reduce household consumption voluntarily through wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays. No arena of activity was exempt from government coordination, including the communication network that had been so vital to the formation of mass consumer culture in the past few decades. Although propaganda had long been an important weapon of government, it became particularly crucial in an age of diverse mass media and at the start of a relatively unpopular war. The federal government eagerly put the press, cinema, mass-reproduced posters, and telephone networks to work promoting America's international crusade and also vilifying the enemy. To prosecute the propaganda war, President Wilson recruited former police reformer George Krill to head the powerful new Committee on Public Information, or CPI. A small army of CPI advertisers, commercial artists, filmmakers, playwrights, and speechwriters saturated public space and mass entertainment outlets with official propaganda. Thousands of posters implored men to sign up and women to ration. Some 75,000 amateur orators delivered short patriotic speeches to cinema audiences. The CPI also commissioned the first official daily government newspapers and first government-made films. Independent filmmakers soon began producing anti-German movies starring well-known actresses including Mary Pickford, nicknamed America's Sweetheart. Tapping into growing use of sexuality in mass advertising, CPI artists crafted commercial images of women that were designed to sell war effort. Millions of recruitment posters and magazine advertisements featured shapely and attractive women who looked male viewers directly in the eye and challenged them to join up. Also, depiction of women as pure and devoted homemakers projected an image of the home as a vital front in the war for global progress. Much of this propaganda demonized the enemy, even though the vast majority of German soldiers were no more and no less morally debased than Allied soldiers. Nonetheless, CPI publicists theorized that by portraying Germany as an anti-democratic autocracy and idealizing the US war effort as a righteous crusade for democracy. All things German fell under suspicion, including German language terms, which the CPI ordered removed from American vocabulary. The flip side of the federal propaganda machine was increased surveillance and censorship of people and ideas that the government deemed unpatriotic or a threat to the war effort. Postal workers opened mail addressed to or from people with German-sounding names, and public schools stopped teaching German. Local and state governments cleared German authors off library shelves and banned performances of Beethoven and other leading German composers. Popular suspicion of Germans fueled older nativist fears of southern and eastern European immigrants, even though Italy had been an ally since 1915 and Tsarist Russia fought on the Allied side. Although the war had slowed European immigration to a trickle, Congress passed the Literacy Act of 1917, which effectively barred entry to poorer immigrants by requiring them to pass a literacy test in their native language. The federal government also targeted war critics and radical labor organizations that argued that the conflict was nothing but a rich man's war. Such critics presented a triple threat in government's eyes. Their radicalism might deter corporate leaders from joining with workers and moderate unions to build a progressive nation. War critic might also radicalize moderate workers, and these dissidents could use the mass media to erode American support for the war effort. At Wilson's prompting, Congress enacted a suite of surveillance laws. The Espionage Act of 1917 prohibited spying, interfering with the draft, and false statements that might impede military success. The Alien Act of 1918 authorized the Commissioner of Immigration to deport immigrants suspected of hostile actions and beliefs. And the Citizen Act of 1918 criminalized making, speaking, or printing statements that intended to cause contempt, or disrepute on the American form of government or to advocate interference with the war effort. The Postmaster General was granted wide-ranging power to ban from the US Postal Service any material that he determined to be treasonous. Anyone convicted of anti-war activities could be imprisoned for up to 20 years. The government's principal targets were the speeches, publication, and organizational activities of the anti-war industrial workers of the world, Socialist Party, and the United Mine Workers and others. At first, in 1917, the US Postal Service suppressed issues of radical newspapers and deprived other newsletters of cheap second-class postage that made their circulation possible. Soon, the Postmaster General ruled that no publication could question the government's motives for entering the war or say that government was a tool of the Wall Street. The government's effort to recruit every American into the war effort enabled labor unions, civilian workers, minorities, and women to contribute directly to the wartime economy. With millions of men conscripted and immigration suspended, employers recruited these groups in the tens of thousands. In the West and Southwest, thousands of Mexican Americans quit their low-paying, hard-toiling farm jobs and joined the industrial workforce. Many of these workers were American citizens, but many others were refugees from the Mexican Revolution. Seeking to boost production without provoking labor unrest, employers offered benefits for the first time, including employee disability insurance, child care services, athletic programs, savings programs, and other attractive benefits. Personnel departments became an indispensable part of most companies. Some corporations, eager to prevent labor unions from forming, also introduced Workers' Council, to which employees elected delegates who relayed workers' concerns and suggestions to management. Workers were happy with many of the new benefits. However, they strongly preferred their own labor unions to the councils that employers often used for surveillance purposes. White women moved into wage work of all kinds, from clerical jobs to auto assembly. Over 1 million mostly single women who had never worked outside the home became wage earners, and millions more left low-paying domestic labor to take jobs as streetcar conductors, secretaries, telephone operators, and others. The shortage of men in the professions also led many medical and other professional schools to admit significant numbers of women for the first time. Thousands of women bucked gender convention by joining militias, asserting a right to take up arms in the defense of themselves and the nation. 34,000 women signed up for service in the armed forces and navy, mostly as nurses, and they served in the Marines as clerical workers. Women eagerly applied to be hello girls for the army near the front lines in France. Some 20,000 navy and army nurses worked in Europe, many on moving hospitals, trains equipped with medical supplies that could transport injured soldiers back from the front lines. American women also participated in the war effort through private organizations such as YWCA. Back home, temperance organizations, long a magnet for women reformers, got a welcome boost from the Army's decision to ban alcohol in the camps. They now renewed their campaign to enforce temperance in American society at large. 18 strongly Protestant states had already prohibited the sale of alcohol, but heavily urbanized states with larger immigrant populations in which the consumption of beer and wine was part of the culture had not followed suit. Prohibitionists capitalized on the perception that beer drinking was German, unpatriotic, and wasteful, and persuaded federal lawmakers to pass the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. The law went into effect in 1920. The war also led suffragists to renew their campaign for women's voting rights. Even though Woodrow Wilson owed his narrow re-election in 1916 to the 12 states that had enfranchised women, he openly opposed women's suffrage. In the winter of 1917, suffragist Alice Paul, a newly established National Women's Party, set up a continuous vigil outside the White House. Bearing placards, they called on the president to recognize women's contribution to the war effort and to practice at home the democracy that he preached abroad. The protesters won extensive press coverage when they were arrested and beaten for allegedly blocking traffic. Convicted and imprisoned, Paul began a well-documented hunger strike that, along with her subsequent force-feeding, became a source of mounting embarrassment for Wilson. Women's lack of voting rights at a time when the government demanded their full participation, coupled with police brutality against the suffragists starkly contradicted Wilson's claim that the United States was bringing democracy to the world. Finally, in the summer of 1918, the president dropped his opposition and announced that women's suffrage was vital to winning the war. In the ensuing midterm elections, suffragists lobbied against the few remaining holdouts in the Senate. Most of the opposing legislatures subsequently lost their seats. When Congress reconvened in May 1919, both houses voted to support the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote. By Election Day 1920, 37 states had ratified the amendment. Although 9 southern states would not ratify the amendment until after 1940, ratification by 3/4 of the states gave women in all 48 states the right to vote in the presidential election of 1920. Now we will discuss Wilson's idea of the New World Order. Wilson presented his ideas before Congress in January 1918. The first 5 of his 14 points called for an open world in which people enjoyed freedom of seas, equal trade opportunities, arms reduction, and the end of colonialism. The right of Europe's many minorities to self-determination was the subject of points 6 through 13. The 14th point called for a general association of nations that would ensure the independence and security of all the world states. Shortly after Wilson presented the 14 points to Allied leaders, Russia announced a global movement with a commitment to struggle for the overthrow of international bourgeoisie and for the creation of an international Soviet Republic. Bolshevism seemed to gather support in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, following the armistice. In the Western Hemisphere, Mexico had enacted a radical constitution that declared all mineral wealth the property of the nation. And in the United States, a small group of American socialists had broken away from Eugene Debs' American Socialist Party and established the Communist Labor Party. Conservatives and progressives alike worried that the world was on the verge of a communist revolution. At the Paris Peace Conference, which began in January 1919, the Allied leaders worked to preserve the old international system of colonies and sphere of interest. The negotiations occurred in secret, and neither Bolshevik Russia nor Germany was admitted to the table. In the end, the Allies opposed all but 2 principles in Wilson's 14 points. They insisted that the heavily industrialized German economy serve as a source of repatriations for the devastating costs of the war, and that Germany be punished through enormous repatriation of over $33 billion. Wilson's principle of self-determination for the smaller states of Europe was honored largely because it suited the Allies to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and parts of what had been the Tsarist Empire. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Finland, Poland, and 5 Balkan states were given independence. Self-determination for Germany's overseas colonies, however, fell by the wayside, with large parts of Middle East becoming mandates a type of colony of Britain and France. Without exception, the independence movement of India, British East Africa, Indochina, and other Allied colonies were rebuffed. The road to domestic peace was equally rocky. The Wilson administration was unprepared for the complex task of demobilization. On the day of armistice, November 11, 1918, the various organization boards and agencies scrambled to cancel all their contracts for food and supplies and lifted price controls. War industries wound down and wheat silos overflowed. The Spanish flu continued unabated. The economic boom of the war years continued for a short time, but in 1919 inflation set in at an annual rate of 15%. Wages dropped, the market for consumer goods collapsed, and recession loomed. As veterans and home front workers of all ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic backgrounds strove to make their wartime gains permanent, they met with considerable resistance and a government that appeared to have lost its way. Workers and labor unions also attempted to parley their wartime advances, but employers rushed to roll back workers' gain and to eject government from its mediating role. Women largely quit industrial work under pressure from both the government and the unions. Industrial workers battled against declining wages and shrinking role of unions. Adopting Wilsonian rhetoric of democratic fight against autocracy, workers denounced as autocratic employers' effort to return to the pre-war status quo in which employers typically set wages and work hours without consultation. The unions demanded a continuation of the wartime model, the 40 to 48 hour week, and union recognition. In the biggest labor action since the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the unions organized a series of strikes involving over 4 million workers. Even Boston's police department refused to work, plunging the city into a chaos. The most paralyzing strike, the steelworkers strike, spread from Chicago across the Northeast and Midwest. Some 350,000 steelworkers demanded an 8-hour workday and union recognition. Employers responded violently, bringing in private armies to break up the strikes and killing at least 18 workers. In the spring and summer of 1919, multiple parcel bombs were sent anonymously to prominent political leaders, judges, industrialists, and the US Attorney General. No one died, although one person was seriously injured. The perpetrators were never identified, which only heightened elite and middle class fear that revolutionary Bolshevism had spread to the United States. As more anti-black violence and industrial strikes broke out in summer of 1919, suspicion also fell on black Americans and striking workers, even though the NAACP and AFL and most labor unions were strongly anti-communist. Finally, in November 1919, the Attorney General ordered federal police to conduct the first of several extensive and well-publicized dragnets of any organizations deemed radical. Most socialist, anarchist, and other leftist organizations and presses were squashed. The remainder got a powerful message that to criticize the government or capitalism was to court state repression. To conclude, it can be said that the years 1914 to 1919 proved to be some of the most difficult of 20th century, and they shaped American politics and global affairs for several decades to come. Within a few years, most Americans would look back on the war not as a crusade for democracy, but as a bleak and senseless tragedy. Above all, the bloodbath in Europe shattered the common progressive belief that civilized people no longer used violence to settle their differences. Equally, by 1920, the progressive vision of collective security and collectivist government were lost causes. The United States never joined the League of Nations, and Woodrow Wilson died in 1924, a broken man. With the election of Warren Harding in 1920, progressivism seemed in full retreat. However, significant strains of progressive thought and a handful of progressive-minded politicians persisted into the 1920s. When the Great Depression devastated the nation and scrambled conservative politics in the early 1930s, the progressives' wartime state would prove a rich reservoir of ideas, personnel, and practical solutions.